Welcome to the Ellevate podcast, conversations with women changing the face of business. And now your hosts, Kristy, Wallace, and Maricella, Herrera.
Hello and welcome to the Ellevate podcast. This is your host, Kristy Wallace, with my co-host, Maricella Herrera. Hi, Maricella. How are you doing on this fine day?
Hey, Kristy. I'm okay, but I'm realizing I haven't had coffee.
What?
Yeah, I know. It just hit me. I started yawning and I'm like, what's wrong with me? And realized I haven't had any coffee.
Well, for our listeners that don't know, Maricella and I are a bit of a coffee snobs. So she was privy to some funny pictures I was sending her of the coffee my parents drink. Hopefully my parents aren't listening to this, but and I was struggling with that. But Maricella, share a little bit why coffee is important to you.
Well, I love coffee, but also my family grows coffee. So I'm from El Salvador, and as probably everyone who listens to us knows, because I say it every other day that I'm on the podcast. So my family grows coffee. So I literally grew up like kids drink milk with chocolate milk. I would drink coffee milk. It's been part of my family and who I am and how I've been raised since I was a kid. And it's really good coffee. I just have to say that. If you have a chance to drink Salvadoran coffee, please do. It's very, very good. You won't regret it. Yeah.
I've had it. I will second that. It is delicious. And hopefully sometime in the not too distant future when you can head back home, Maricella, for a visit, we'll all reap the benefits of that and get some coffee.
Yeah. Who knows when that will be? I mean, not just pandemic wise, but
yeah,
so many reasons why.
So many reasons why. I know our world. But Maricella, we are working to make the world a better place. And I know that our guest today, Kristyn Klei Borrero, is as well. She's incredibly passionate about education and supporting our teachers in building different strengths and muscles and creating a no-nonsense nurture system in the classroom to kind of really help students excel and succeed. Also, she does a lot of work around culturally relevant classrooms and has found that, much of that work is important pre-COVID, but certainly now as we are in the throes of remote learning and looking like that will not be ending anytime soon either.
Yeah.
So I really loved what Kristyn had to say.
How has it been for you? I mean, I know we've talked about it a little bit, but it's interesting in the context of what she's doing. I mean, you have your kids at home.
I do. It's been hard. It's been really hard. I have no other words for it. I think for me personally, having three small children, it was, when we first, being in New York City, when we first started sheltering in place and homeschooling, it was, under the impression that maybe it would be for about a month. So you're kind of preparing for the sprint. You're like, I can get through this. And then you realize it's the marathon and it's 3.5 months. And so I barely made it over the finish line. But, I struggled with the fact that a lot of my interactions with my kids was around schooling and, struggling with that identity, wanting to be the mom. There's an interesting, I think, New York Times article about, the identities of parents and who gets to be the fun one, who does the games and who's the one who's fighting them to get their homework done. But, all in, it was eye-opening and in a good way. I mean, the teachers in the school really rose to the challenge, really innovated, tapped into new perspectives, new approaches. And I have to say, and maybe I should be embarrassed about this, but I won't be, is I have such a deeper understanding of what my kids are learning and how they learn and the subject matter than I ever did before. I mean, I can't say that I really knew, what they did every day at school. And now I do. And I feel like that'll set me up in the future for being a better ally and supporter for them in their educational journey.
I love that.
So, yeah. but it's been a lot. I'm happy someone's here right now.
I mean, I know I can't imagine, honestly. I don't know how you do it.
Well, we have to, right? We have to, and that's why it's just been so helpful to me to have you, Maricella, to have my friends, my peers, my family, my coworkers, all in my corner supporting me. Let's get to my interview with Kristyn. Kristyn, thank you so much for joining me today on the Ellevate podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to join y'all today.
So we wanted to get started with a little bit about you. Tell us about Kristyn and how you got to where you are today.
Oh, that's a great question. So where I got to where I am today. So today I am the co-founder and CEO of CT3. We're an educational organization that serves mostly historically marginalized communities and schools that have been typically disenfranchised and students that don't always have the access that they should in our public education system. And we do that through culturally relevant and moving into the anti-racism space of giving real-time feedback to teachers, coaches, and leaders so we can amplify our practice in real time. What took me to that space, though, was I grew up with two amazing parents, my father, who was a serial entrepreneur, and my mother, who instilled in her three daughters that they could do anything. And when I went off to college, thought that I would probably go off to medical school or go to physical therapy school because I was a dyslexic kid that was really good at science. And I was one of the few girls in the AP science classes in high school and those types of things. And I was very fortunate to go to public school throughout my K-12 education career, and was engaged with a rich variety of people from different backgrounds and races and socioeconomic statuses. When I got to college and started studying science, I realized that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach. I wanted to make impact in the greater civil rights movement. And I saw education as being one of those spaces that I could really have an impact, particularly as a white woman. And so changed my major, or added a major so I could become an elementary education major as well, and started my career in the school district that helped to raise me back in Ohio. Taught for 4 years, got to do some amazing presentations, and eventually moved to California for grad school, where I was given the privilege to lead schools at a very young age as a turnaround principal, where I would go into both East Palo Alto and Oakland schools, and those that had been struggling for years on end. I would go in as the principal, and we would do rapid turnaround in 2 to 3 years, where the schools would then compete, historically, with schools that typically did very well from academic standpoints. We did that by just really engaging with the community and engaging with all the assets that our students brought to us. One of the things that I realized that I wasn't very good at that turned eventually into CT3 was I could support teachers in their teaching practice, but I was really struggling to help them with how to engage students that didn't look or sound like them all the time, through whether it be classroom management practices and sometimes with their ability to really engage in relationships with youth that they didn't see that they had a lot in common with right off the bat. And so took a partnership up with Lee Cantor, and we went out and started studying what do the highest performing teachers in the country do to build these relationships. And I did it to really solve the problem at my schools. I'm a big believer in that if you have a problem, don't complain about it, go out and solve it. So it was really going out to solve it for the schools that I was supporting. And in doing that, we came up with what the kids that we interviewed named their teachers as no nonsense nurturer. So that's where all of our work is based on, is how to support teachers to become no nonsense nurturers for their students and leaders for their teachers. And that grew into eventually moving cognitive coaching protocols into real-time feedback. So teachers and leaders could hear feedback immediately on how to better to support those that they had agency of supporting, and changing muscle memory and creating practices that were relevant, applicable in the moment so they could feel the successes right away. And so that's what we do now. And that's what I get to lead now, is an amazing team of educational leaders who have decided to impact other education leaders across the country.
That's amazing. I guess we're saying amazing a lot here, but it is. And my mom was an educator, my sister as well. So I really believe in the power of teachers and the education system. But I also have seen firsthand a lot of the weaknesses and flaws within our system that is in many ways so antiquated. And it's really come to light even more so in the past couple months with COVID-19 and remote learning, as you start to see, the differences from teacher to teacher, school district to school district, access to the tools and resources to navigate learning. And I think particularly for teachers, it's a different identity. It's an identity shift and a different way to communicate and connect with students. So I imagine that a lot of the work you're doing is never more important than it is now and looking into the future. So I would love to just hear, what have you seen through the past couple months specifically with the pandemic and, what it's exposed with our educational system, the strengths, weaknesses, and something parents should be thinking about during this time and moving into the fall?
So I think the pandemic is one thing that we pay attention to in education, and it's incredibly important as we move from the traditional in-person space to a much more virtual space. But something that we also can't ignore in the space of education is the race revolution we're having in this country that is long overdue. And it's challenging us at CT3 is to really look at our work. We've always been very proud of our work and being culturally relevant and seeing assets in kids and teachers and the folks that we serve. But now we really need to move into more of an anti-racist space where we're interrogating our protocols to make sure that not only are we doing things that are culturally relevant, but also really owning the space of ensuring that every lesson that we teach and each time we get to engage with students and communities, that we're in a space of like seeing the humanness and the equality and engaging so we're making one another just better human beings for tomorrow and so that we all can succeed. So we have a whole new, rebirth that we really need to that we're engaging in at CT3, which is one to take our in-person supports and put them in the virtual space, but also do it through a much more thoughtful and anti-racist lens versus just a cultural competency lens. And so as families start engaging in this space and as teachers are engaging in this space, we've seen a lot of data come out where teachers aren't feeling very successful with building relationships with students, or that their lessons have the same amount of power that they did when they were in the in-person space. And so a lot of the work that we're doing at CT3 is to provide direct coaching now in the virtual space for teachers so that they can raise the level of rigor and cultural relevance and meet the needs of students both socio-emotionally as well as academically. Because the other thing the pandemic's done for our students is it's placed a whole new level for some kids of trauma, but for other kids of just uncomfortableness around, that's not a word, but we're going to make it a word for this podcast, of feeling more comfortable in a virtual space. We think of young people as being always really engaged and excited about the virtual space, but the lack of human contact that is so important in learning for all students is really missing right now. And we're going to have a huge education gap that now currently exist amongst Black and Brown kids in our country. But now we're going to see an education gap that, folks of means and white folks have never experienced, I think, before, because there's a new level of learning that's having to happen for every educator that's much more difficult to tackle than I think anyone actually realizes. So one of the ways that we're trying to really be supportive is understanding where teachers are, trying to meet them where they are, and then trying to be supportive of them on how to engage with students in the virtual space. Because sometimes it's as simple as, I don't know how to run the Zoom, or I don't know how to put kids in the breakout rooms. And if we alleviate that nervousness, then they can engage in stronger pedagogy that they can borrow from their traditional classroom experience. But if we don't look to really unpack what is unnerving for both our students and our educators, we're going to keep coming up against real challenges in our work. And so I think right now at CT3, we're certainly being more thoughtful about listening so we can get it right instead of being right as to what educators really need for us to support them, both with their pedagogy as well as with their virtual agendas right now.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the school. My children go to a New York City public school, and with this school, on a number of levels, we certainly saw, as you're saying, a huge variety of comfort and competency with technology and different teaching styles. Some teachers really shown to me as like, finding out how to do bingo and finding out how to do different things to engage the children in learning in this virtual space. And we're really creative. Also, how the school has always really reinforced anti-racism, talking about it in the classroom, looking at the representation in books and in literature. But certainly during this time, was very, very explicit and very intentional with our community, from everything from the art projects through to science, math, across the board. Teachers really seem to have a cohesive understanding of how to talk to children, how to incorporate it into the work, how to make it a discussion, and also supporting parents. And they send a lot of resources home for parents, and it made me just proud to see that during a time of just upheaval and heartbreak and just even little kids, like you see the inequalities, you see what's happening in this world, and to feel like they're 360 supported, in the home and in the school, and they spend so much time in their school. But I know in my conversations with others that, our school was an oddity, to be able to pivot that way, to be able to address the needs of students in these conversations in a meaningful way. And I'm interested in hearing from you about this more, knowledge sharing across schools, across districts. Really, how are we connecting what's working, what's not working in a meaningful way that goes beyond, the smaller ecosystem?
I think one of the things that you're experiencing is amazing, but we want to make sure every student, every child in this country has access to that, right? So one of the things that we do at CT3 constantly is we look at our work as an action research project. It is never done. It is never complete. So we're constantly, even when we're in organizations, coaching teachers, training coaches, supporting leaders, coaching leaders, we're still looking for those practices and trying to codify those practices that are outlier practices of some teachers or some leaders, so then we can replicate that and teach that to others. That's all, folks ask me all the time, Kristyn, in your book, Every Student, Every Day, and your no nonsense nurture practices, why does all of this work so well? And the honest answer is that I just wrote about it. I codified the practices. I learned how to be a researcher at UC Berkeley during my doctoral work, but I'm a practitioner at heart. So what I did is I went in and what I still do and what many of our associates still do is we look at what are the best practices that educators, many times outlier educators, are doing, or what are some of the cultural moves that leaders are ensuring that are happening, and how do we replicate those in other spaces so it's not just some have access to these great practices and protocols, but all can have practices for that. So I think one of the things that sets us apart from other educational organizations or professional development organizations is that the work is never done, and we see it that way and as an action research project, and how can we support and replicate practices in new and different spaces. So in the case of you experiencing this amazing work with your students, how do we make sure that students on, in the Upper East Side, as well as in the Bronx, as well as in Brooklyn, as well as in Oakland, California, or in Jackson, Mississippi, have that same access? And a lot of that is having access to coaching and access to the knowledge of best practices. And I don't think we recognize how much additional training and support teachers need once they have that undergraduate or even graduate degree. The needs of students is constantly changing, and how we teach from year to year, much less decade to decade, needs to look different because our world looks different. And so if we allow teachers, or if we're not supportive of teachers when they're relying on lesson plans from 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or even when they first started their careers, that's educational malpractice if we're not supporting them from the administrative and district levels. Because unless they have access to that new knowledge, unless they have access to that new training, unless teachers have access to those new coaching practices, why would I shift my practice? Classrooms need to be open doors The virtual space needs to be open for an education so that teachers can be receiving feedback and constantly thinking about, even interrogating their own practices, so that for each generation of kids that sits before them, they're meeting their needs in this ever changing world. What it looked like to be a 10th grader when I was in school is very different than what it looks like to be a 10th grader now. Now you can be taking college classes. You can be in early college high school. You can be taking technology classes and getting, your AA before you even graduate. That didn't exist when I was in school. So how I teach and what those opportunities are needs to look very different with each passing years. And so I think the work that we do at CT3 is really important, and that we're just continually trying to codify practices and then pass those along to historically disenfranchised schools in those communities.
Who pays for this? Is this the PTA, the school district, the individual teacher? I mean, what is the funding for ongoing professional development and support for teachers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something that is significantly underfunded in this country. So we have Title I and Title II funds that come from the federal government, and those have been, increasingly being underfunded over these last several years. And so typically we get paid out of Title I and Title II funding or grants, and those again come from the federal government. But you'll remember that education is also the responsibility of the state. So oftentimes there are also state grants that can pay for this work. And there are many foundations that see how they're impacting social justice in their communities is through education. So that's another place where oftentimes funding comes from, is from community foundations or larger philanthropic organizations that really see the way to impact their tomorrows or to have stronger employees in their futures is to impact their local education system. So those would be the main sources for how folks pay for teacher training and development.
So my kids just recently came out of school. Many kids are starting up again soon, depending on where you live in the world and in the United States. What are things that we as voters heading into elections, we as parents, we as community and citizens should be thinking about in regards to how we support our schools, our teachers, and our communities? Given what we've talked about with virtual learning and the changing world, there's so much there. And I think education is a cornerstone of our society. And there's a lot of cracks in that stone. And everyone, regardless of whether you're a parent or not, can play a role in creating something better moving forward. So do you have any, the top thing you would suggest for people to do to be engaged and active in making our teachers better supported and our education system stronger?
So we have big elections coming up in November, whether it be for your school board or for local levies or for Congress people and, frankly, the President of the United States. The thing that I would really ask folks to focus on is not be single issue voters. Look at the whole dynamic of the candidate. Are they supportive of public schools? Public schools give access to everyone. Or are they more supportive of private industry and schools being supported on the private end? So I would look at that. I would look at what is their stance on including all groups of people in the types of legislation they're putting forward, making sure that they have a culturally competent, a socially just, an anti-racist framework even. But I would encourage voters just to be really thoughtful of not being single issue voters. And so also there's many levies coming out, and more so now than ever, schools need those levies to pass, whether it be for capital improvements for their buildings or in order to support teacher salaries or professional development. Because with COVID and in the space that we're in right now, many schools are supported based on their local tax dollars. Well, when the economy is not up and running, we don't have the tax dollars to continue to support that. So whenever possible, support levies in your school district, but then also hold your school boards and your superintendents accountable for what you want to see come out of those dollars that you vote for. I think those are super important. As an organization and as our community project, we always get together as a CT3 group, and we think about how do we want to impact the larger community. And we're engaging as an organization with the organization of when we all vote, because it's something that we can do virtually. It's something that we can do as a team building activity. And it's also something that we can do in order to impact the greater good in our country. So voting is one of those things that's the way that we have all voices represented. We can speak on behalf of our children. We can speak on behalf of our own values. But go out there and vote, but vote on more than just one issue. And there is absolutely no excuse in this country for anybody not to get out and vote. Please do mail-in ballots, or ask folks. There are so many resources now that will come and pick you up and take you to the polls. There's so many things so that we can all have our voices heard. That if there's an excuse that you have, reach out to the folks when we all vote, because they will help you have your voice heard through your votes.
Excellent. I love it. Kristyn, thank you so much for joining us today on the Ellevate podcast. It was really wonderful to speak with you, and I would love to continue this conversation in the fall and moving forward, because I think we're going to see a lot of great things changing, as well as a lot of important work to be done. And certainly it sounds like CT3 is leading the way in making our schools, our teachers, our communities stronger and better moving forward. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. And as the doors get opened as to how we'll see that school opens next year, we'll continue to engaging to support those schools all around the country, and we're excited to do that. Thanks for having me, and thanks for talking about the work of education today.
Of course.
Thanks so much for listening to Ellevate. If you like what you hear, help a girl out. Subscribe to the Ellevate podcast on iTunes. Give us 5 stars and share your review. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at EllevateNTWK, that's Ellevate Network, and become a member. You can learn all about membership and all the great things that Ellevate Network is doing at our website, www.ellevatenetwork.com. That's ELLEVATE network.com. And special thanks to our producer, Catherine Heller. She rocks. And to our voiceover artist, Rachel Griesinger. Thanks so much, and join us next week.